Life of St. Augustine by Possidius. Part 3. Chapter 9. He contends with the Donatists. As bishop, Augustine preached the word of eternal salvation much more earnestly and fervently, and with greater authority, no longer in one district only, but wherever he went, in answer to requests, ready always to give an answer to every man that asked of him a reason of the faith and hope which is toward God. And the Church of the Lord flourished, and grew rapidly and strongly. The Donatists in particular, who lived in Hippo and the neighboring towns, brought his addresses and writings to their bishops. And if when they had heard these, they perchance made any reply, they were either refuted by their own followers, or else their replies were brought to the holy Augustine. And when he had reviewed them patiently and calmly, and, as it is written, he worked out the salvation of men with fear and trembling, showing how they would and could refute nothing, and how true and manifest is that doctrine which the Church of God holds and has understood. On these things he labored continually, by day and by night. He even wrote private letters to prominent bishops of this error, and to laymen, urging and exhorting them, by the arguments which he offered, that they should either abandon the error, or at least enter into a discussion with him. In their distrust they were never willing even to answer him in writing, but in anger spoke furiously, privately and publicly declaring that Augustine was a seducer and deceiver of souls. They said and preached that the wolf must be killed in defense of their flock, and neither fearing God nor ashamed before men, they taught the people to believe that whoever should be able to do this would undoubtedly have all his sins forgiven by God. Meanwhile, Augustine sought to make known all their lack of confidence in their own cause, and when they met in public conferences, they did not dare to debate with him. Chapter 10. The madness of the Circumcellions. These Donatists had in nearly all their churches an unusual kind of men, perverse and violent, going about under a profession of continency, who were called Circumcellions. They were very numerous, and formed themselves into bands throughout almost all the regions of Africa. Inspired by evil teachers, in their insolent boldness and lawless temerity, they never spared either their own or strangers, and in violation of right and justice deprived men of their civil rights, and unless men obeyed, they were visited with the severest losses and injuries, when, armed with every kind of weapon, the Circumcellions madly overran the farms and estates, and did not even hesitate to shed human blood. But, while the word of God was diligently preached, whenever any plan of peace was suggested to those who hated peace, they freely assailed whoever talked of it. And when, despite their teachings, the truth became known, those who would and could do so either openly tore themselves away from them, or secretly withdrew, and, together with as many of their friends as they could obtain, adhered to the peace and unity of the Church. As a result, seeing that the congregations of their error were growing smaller, and being envious of the growth of the Church, these heretics were inflamed and burned with fiercest wrath, and with the help of their confederates began intolerable persecutions against the unity of the Church. They made daily and nightly attacks even upon the Catholic priests and ministers, and robbed them of all their possessions. And they crippled many of the servants of God by tortures. They also threw lime mixed with vinegar in the eyes of some, and others they murdered. Wherefore these rebaptizing Donatists came to be hated even by their own. Chapter 11. Progress of the Church through Augustine. Now, as the divine teachings prospered, the clergy in the church at Hippo, who had served God under and with the holy Augustine in the monastery, began to be ordained. And the truth taught by the Catholic Church, the manner of life of the holy servants of God, their continence and abject poverty, became more known and celebrated day by day. Then the Church, for the sake of its peace and unity, first began to demand with great eagerness bishops and clergy from the monastery which had begun to exist and grow through the efforts of that memorable man, and later obtained them. And there were about 10 men, holy and venerable, continent and learned, whom the most blessed Augustine furnished in answer to our request to various churches, some of them quite prominent. And likewise these two who came from that fellowship of holy men increased the churches of the Lord, and also established monasteries. And as their zeal for spreading the word of God grew, they furnished other churches with their brethren, whom they promoted to the priesthood. Therefore the teaching of the salutary faith, hope, and love of the Church became known through many and to many, not only throughout all parts of Africa, but even in the churches across the sea, through the books which were edited and translated into the Greek tongue. Thus, by that one man, and through him to many, by the grace of God it was all brought to public knowledge. And so, as it is written, the wicked man saw it and was grieved. He gnashed with his teeth and melted away. But thy servants, as it is said, were for peace with those who hated peace, and whenever they spoke, they were willingly overcome by them. Chapter 12. By the error of his guide, Augustine escapes an ambush laid for him. But several times these circumcellions, fully armed, beset the roads, even against Augustine the servant of God, when, as it chanced, he went on request to visit, instruct, and exhort the Catholic people, as he frequently did. Now it once happened that, although they were out in full force, they yet failed to capture him. For through the error of his guide, and yet, in fact, by the providence of God, it happened that the bishop with his companions came to his destination by a different road, and he learned later that through this error he had escaped their impious hands, and together with all he gave thanks to God the Deliverer. And they, according to their custom, spared neither laymen nor clergy, as the public records witness. In this connection we must not pass over in silence the things which were done and accomplished to the glory of God by the ardor of that man so distinguished in the Church and in his zeal for the house of God, against the rebaptizing Donatists mentioned above. When on one occasion one of the bishops he had furnished to the Church from his monastery and clergy visited the diocese of the Church of Calama, which was under his care, and, for the peace of the Church, had preached against the heresy such things as he had learned, it happened that in the midst of his journey he fell into their ambush, and though he escaped with all his companions, the animals and baggage were taken from them, and they left him grievously injured and wounded. Wherefore, in order that the progress of the peace of the Church might not be further hindered, the defender of the Church was not silent before the law. And Crispinus, who was bishop of the Donatists in the city and region of Calama, for some time well known, and also a learned man, was admonished that he was liable to the fine of gold fixed by the civil laws against heretics. When he protested against the laws and was brought before the proconsul, he denied that he was a heretic. Then it became necessary, when the defender of the Church withdrew, that he should be opposed by a Catholic bishop, and be convicted of being what he denied he was. For if he had succeeded in his dissimulation, the ignorant perhaps would have believed that the heretic was a Catholic bishop, since he denied being what he was. And so a stumbling block might have been placed in the way of the weak because of this neglect. And since the illustrious Bishop Augustine firmly insisted on it, both the bishops of Calama met for discussion, and for the third time they met in conflict concerning their different communions, while a great multitude of Christians at Carthage and throughout all Africa awaited the result of the case. And Crispinus was pronounced a heretic by proconsular and libellary sentence. But the Catholic bishop interceded with the judge on his behalf that the fine of gold should not be exacted, and the favor was obtained for him. But when Crispinus ungratefully appealed to the most clement prince, a final answer from the emperor was due to his appeal, and accordingly the order was issued that the Donatist heretics should have no rights in any place, and that they should everywhere be held to the full force of all the laws enacted against heretics. By this order also the judge and the officers of his court, and Crispinus himself, though he had not previously been compelled to pay, were all enjoined to pay 10 pounds of gold to the credit of the treasury. Immediately every effort was made by the Catholic bishops, and especially by Augustine of holy memory, that this condemnation of all should be withdrawn through the indulgence of the emperor. With the aid of the Lord this was accomplished. Through this vigilance and holy zeal the Church increased greatly. Chapter 13. For all these labors for the peace of the Church, the Lord gave the palm to Augustine in this life, and reserved with himself the crown of righteousness for him. And more, by the aid of Christ, the unity of peace, that is, the fraternity of the Church of God, grew and multiplied from day to day. This was especially advanced after the conference which was held a little later at Carthage by all the Catholic bishops, with these same bishops of the Donatists, at the command of the most glorious and devout Emperor Honorius, who, in order to bring this about, had sent the tribune and notary Marcellinus from his own court to Africa as judge. In this conference the Donatists were completely silenced, and being convicted of error by the Catholics, were reprimanded by sentence of the judge. After their appeal, these unrighteous men were condemned as heretics by the rescript of the most pious ruler. For this reason their bishops, more than before, together with their clergy and people, enjoyed our communion, maintained the Catholic peace, and endured many persecutions, even to the loss of life and limb. And this good was begun and completed, as I said, by that holy man, while our fellow bishops consented, and were equally pleased. End of Part 3.